Incident log entry number 001. Date, unité 2023. Time, 14:47 and 32 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Emergency Communications Analyst. Facility, Deep 6 Underground Communications Hub. Classification, Priority Alpha, ****. The alert peers through the bunker's perpetual hum at exactly 14 hours, 47 minutes, and 32 seconds. And I knew immediately that something was wrong. Not with the message itself. God knows we processed thousands of emergency broadcasts over the years, each one a carefully orchestrated dance of terror and reassurance. But this one felt different. The timestamp was clean, the formatting perfect, the automated voice crisp and unwavering as it echoed through our subterranean facility. Emergency alert. Unknown object impact imminent. 12 minutes to impact. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a test. I should explain why I'm documenting this. Protocol dictates that all alpha-level incidents require detailed logs. But that's not really why I'm typing these words into the bunker's terminal system at 3 a.m., 3 days after everything went to hell. I'm recording this because someone needs to know what really happened down here. Someone needs to understand that the 12 minutes in that alert weren't counting down to impact. They were counting down to the moment everything I thought I knew about my job, my colleagues, and myself would shatter like glass against concrete. My workstation sits in the heart of Deep 6 Communications Center, surrounded by banks of monitors that flicker with an almost organic rhythm. The walls down here are thick concrete painted institutional green, designed to withstand nuclear blasts and house the most sophisticated emergency broadcast system on the eastern seaboard. We're the ones who decide what the surface world hears when crisis strikes. At least, that's what I believed until Tuesday afternoon. The alert came through Channel 7, our direct military feed from NORAD. Standard stuff, except for the object designation. Usually we get specifics, asteroid trajectory, missile launch coordinates, weather system classifications. Unknown object was frustratingly vague, the kind of terminology that made my analytical mind itch. I've been processing emergency communications for 8 years, ever since my master's degree in signal processing landed me this position 400 feet below the Virginia countryside. I know the patterns, the language, the bureaucratic poetry of disaster management. This didn't fit. I pulled up the alert's metadata, my fingers dancing across the holographic keyboard that projected from my desk surface. The blue light cast strange shadows on my hands as I dug into the signal's origin trail. Clean routing through 17 relay stations, perfect encryption signatures, authentication codes that checked out flawlessly. Everything indicated a legitimate NORAD emergency broadcast, yet something in my gut twisted like a knife. "Marsh, you seeing this?" Dorian Lark's voice cut through my concentration from the workstation beside mine. Military communications officer, officially. Unofficially, he was the liaison who made sure our civilian operations stayed aligned with national defense priorities. Tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of precisely maintained beard that suggested military discipline even in civilian clothes. His fingers drummed against his desk in a nervous pattern I'd never seen before. The unknown object alert. I swiveled my chair toward him, noting how the bunker's fluorescent lights seemed to flicker in rhythm with the steady pulse of our processing servers. I'm running diagnostics now. Metadata looks clean, but the classification is irregular. Dorian's brown eyes held something I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or recognition. How irregular? NORAD doesn't use unknown object designations for impact scenarios. They have 67 specific classification codes for orbital threats. Unknown isn't one of them. I turned back to my screens, pulling up the standard reference database. Besides, 12 minutes is an impossible warning window for anything big enough to matter. Atmospheric entry calculations would give us hours of notice for a significant impact, not minutes. The alert repeated itself through the facility's speakers, that same calm, artificial voice delivering its message of imminent doom. I found myself counting the seconds. 720 left on the countdown, 719, 718. Around us, the bunker's skeleton crew moved with practiced efficiency. Emergency protocols engaged automatically. External communications locked down, surface broadcast systems primed for mass alert distribution, emergency power systems spinning up with their characteristic whine. But nobody seemed particularly worried about being vaporized in 11 minutes and 36 seconds. That's when I noticed the first real anomaly. My workstation's primary monitor flickered. Not the steady, predictable flicker of aging fluorescence, but a deliberate pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS in Morse code, repeating every 30 seconds like a digital heartbeat. Dorian, my voice came out steadier than I felt. Are you seeing visual artifacts on your displays? He leaned forward, studying his screens with new intensity. Define artifacts. Morse code, SOS pattern, embedded in the signal refresh rate. His face went pale. Military communications officers don't go pale unless something is very, very wrong. Isolde, he'd never used my first name at work before. I need you to run a full signal analysis on that alert. Everything, origin trace, routing history, embedded data, the works. But keep it quiet. Quiet from who? Everyone else. The countdown reached 8 minutes as I dove into the signal's architecture. My specialized software peeling back layers of encryption and routing data like an archaeological dig through digital sediment. What I found in those buried data packets made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The alert wasn't just being broadcast to our facility for processing and redistribution to the surface. It was being generated by our facility, by someone sitting in this very bunker, using our own systems to terrify the population above ground. 6 minutes remained on the countdown when I realized that the unknown object wasn't coming from space at all. It was already here. Incident log, entry number 002. Date, unité 2023. Time, 15:23 and 17 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Emergency Communications Analyst. Facility, Deep 6 Underground Communications Hub. Classification, Priority Alpha, ****. The silence after the countdown reached 0 was deafening. 12 minutes had passed. No impact. No flash of light through the bunker's reinforced observation windows. No seismic tremors through the facility's shock-absorbing foundations. Just the steady hum of our life support systems and the gentle whisper of recycled air through the ventilation ducts. Everyone in the communication center had frozen at their workstations, waiting for something that never came. The emergency protocols that had engaged automatically began their shutdown sequence with a series of mechanical clicks and electronic chirps. Status lights shifted from red back to green. The bunker's artificial atmosphere returned to its normal rhythm of controlled breathing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all holding our breath for the wrong reasons. False alarm, announced Cash in Black from his position near the security station. The bunker security chief had appeared during the countdown, like a shadow materializing from the facility's deeper levels. Tall, lean, with silver streak hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of our workspace. Probably a glitch in the NORAD systems. Happens more often than the public realizes. His voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to explaining away inconvenient questions, but I caught the way his gaze lingered on my workstation's displays. Something about his presence made the bunker's recycled air feel thinner, harder to breathe. 12-minute countdown to nothing, I muttered, ostensibly to my computer, but loud enough for Dorian to hear. That's not how glitches work. Dorian's response was interrupted by a sharp electronic tone, the distinctive alert chime that preceded emergency broadcasts. My blood went cold as the same artificial voice filled the communications center. Emergency alert. Unknown object impact imminent. 47 minutes to impact. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a test. This time, everyone noticed the discrepancy. 47 minutes? Yvain Monroe's voice cut through the renewed tension. I've been hoping she would show up. My colleague and closest friend in this sterile underground world, a civilian data analyst whose sharp mind had saved my sanity more than once during our years working together. She stood near the auxiliary terminals, her dark hair pulled back in the efficient ponytail she favored during crisis situations, brown eyes already scanning the displays with the same analytical intensity one felt building in my own chest. The timestamp's wrong, she continued, moving to the workstation beside mine. If this is the same alert system, the same unknown object, how did the impact window suddenly expand to 47 minutes? Objects don't slow down in space. I pulled up the new alert's metadata, my fingers moving with practice speed across the holographic interface. The data painted a picture that made no sense. Same authentication codes, same routing signatures, same NORAD origin markers. But the timestamp showed this alert had been generated 3 minutes before the first one, making it technically older than the 12-minute countdown we'd just experienced. Time paradox. I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. We're getting alerts out of sequence. Cashin moved closer to our workstations, his footsteps echoing oddly in the bunker's acoustically treated space. Temporal anomalies in emergency broadcast systems are documented phenomena. Solar flare interference, satellite relay delays, quantum fluctuations in the communication arrays. The explanations rolled off his tongue with the smooth confidence of someone who'd used them before. But I'd spent 8 years studying signal processing, and I knew bullshit when I heard it. Quantum fluctuations don't rewrite timestamps, I said, meeting his pale gray eyes directly. And they don't embed Morse code patterns in display refresh rates. Yvain's head snapped toward me. Morse code. I showed her the pattern on my monitors, the subtle SOS signal still flashing in the screen's refresh cycle, now accompanied by a new pattern I hadn't noticed before. 3 long flashes, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. GLRT. I ran it through my mental Morse code dictionary, a skill I'd picked up during my graduate studies in military communications. GLRT, I spelled out. Or possibly GLRE. The pattern's not perfectly consistent. Glare, Yvain suggested. Like, something is creating interference? Before I could respond, the alert repeated itself, but this time the artificial voice carried a subtle distortion, a barely perceptible stutter on the word imminent that made my skin crawl. It was the kind of digital artifact that suggested signal manipulation, the electronic equivalent of a forged signature. Dorian had gone completely silent, his fingers hovering over his keyboard as if afraid to touch it. The military bearing he usually carried like armor seemed to be cracking under some invisible pressure. Dorian, I said carefully, is there something about this alert we should know? He looked up from his screens, and I saw something in his expression that chilled me more than the countdown ever had. Fear, yes, but also recognition. And beneath that, a flicker of what might have been guilt. I need to make some calls, he said, standing abruptly. Check with my contacts at NORAD. Verify the alert's authenticity through back channels. Your contacts? Yvain raised an eyebrow. I thought you were a NORAD contact. I'm liaison, not command structure. There are other channels for verification. He was already moving toward the secure communication booth at the far end of the center. Keep monitoring the signals. If anything else comes through, document everything. As his footsteps faded down the corridor, I turned back to my analysis of the alert patterns. The more I dug into the data, the more convinced I became that these weren't random system failures or cosmic interference. Someone was deliberately manipulating our emergency broadcast system, using our own facility's resources to create false alerts. But why? And more importantly, who had the access and knowledge to penetrate our security systems so thoroughly? Isolde, Yvain's voice was barely above a whisper. Look at this. She pulled up the facility's internal communication logs, the digital paper trail that tracked every message, every alert, every data packet that flowed through deep sick servers. What she showed me made my analytical mind recoil in disbelief. The alerts weren't just being broadcast through our facility. According to the logs, they were being generated by our facility, by someone with administrative access to the emergency broadcast system, someone who knew exactly how to make false alerts look authentic, someone who is sitting in this bunker right now, watching us try to unravel their work. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just monitoring a crisis. We were trapped inside one. Incident log entry number 003. Date, unité 2023. Time, 16:41 and 52 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Emergency Communications Analyst. Facility, Deep 6 Underground Communications Hub. Classification, Priority Alpha, ***. The revelation that our own facility was generating the false alerts should have been the end of the mystery. Instead, it became the beginning of something far worse. I'd spent the last hour diving deeper into Deep 6 communication protocols, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of encrypted data streams and authentication matrices. What I found made my hands shake as I typed this entry. The alerts weren't just originating from our facility. They were being crafted with surgical precision, using my own signal processing algorithms as their foundation. Isolde, you need to see this. Yvain's voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. She'd been working at the auxiliary terminal, cross-referencing the alert timestamps with our facility's access logs. Her face had gone pale in the harsh LED lighting, making the dark circles under her eyes look like bruises. I rolled my chair over to her workstation, where she pulled up a visualization of network traffic flowing through Deep 6 servers. The display showed data streams as flowing ribbons of light, but something was wrong with the pattern. Instead of the usual steady flow of routine communications, I saw sporadic bursts of high-intensity data packets, like someone was injecting foreign code into our systems in short, violent pulses. When did this start? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. 3 days ago, right around the time you submitted your quarterly report on emergency broadcast optimization. She turned to face me, and I saw my own growing horror reflected in her expression. Isolde, someone's been using your research. The signal modulation techniques you developed, the authentication bypass protocols you documented for security testing. It's all here in the alert generation code. My throat went dry. 3 months ago, I'd submitted a comprehensive analysis of vulnerabilities in the emergency broadcast system, complete with theoretical exploitation methods. It was supposed to help strengthen our defenses against foreign interference. Instead, someone had turned it into a blueprint for psychological warfare. The secure communication booth at the far end of the center remained sealed, Dorian's voice occasionally audible as a low murmur through the soundproof walls. He'd been in there for over an hour, supposedly coordinating with his NORAD contacts. But the longer he stayed isolated, the more suspicious his behavior seemed. A new alert tone pierced the air, not the standard emergency broadcast chime, but something else entirely. A low, warbling sound that made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly around the edges. The main display flickered to life with a message that defied everything I understood about emergency protocols. Emergency alert. Unknown object impact imminent. -7 minutes to impact. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a test. -7 minutes. An impossible countdown to an event that had supposedly already happened. The timestamp showed the alert had been generated 15 seconds in the future, another temporal impossibility that made my analytical mind reel. That's new, Yvain whispered, but her voice sounded distant, as if she were speaking through water. I tried to access the alert's source code, but my terminal responded with error messages I'd never seen before. Instead of the usual system diagnostics, my screen filled with what looked like corrupted text, Strings of characters that almost formed words, patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. That's when Cashin Black emerged from wherever he'd been lurking. Having trouble with the systems? His voice carried the same casual authority as before, but now I caught the underlying current of satisfaction. He moved between our workstations like a predator circling wounded prey, his pale eyes taking in every detail of our displays. "Someone's compromising our servers," I said, not bothering to hide my suspicion, using administrative access to generate false emergency alerts. "Whoever's doing this knows our security protocols intimately." "Concerning," he replied, but his tone suggested he found it anything but. "I suppose we'll need to initiate lockdown protocols. Restrict access to essential personnel only. Maintain communication silence until we can identify the source of the intrusion." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Lockdown protocols would isolate us completely from the outside world, cutting off our ability to warn anyone about the false alerts or call for help. It would also give whoever was manipulating our systems complete control over our information flow. "That seems extreme," Yvain said, echoing my thoughts. "We could just trace the unauthorized access, identify." "I'm afraid that won't be possible." Cashin's smile was arctic. "You see, the security breach you've discovered isn't external. It's internal. Someone with legitimate access has been using their credentials to compromise our emergency systems." He was looking directly at me when he said it. "You're suggesting I'm sabotaging my own research?" The accusation was so absurd it took me a moment to process it fully. I'm the one who discovered the security breach. I'm the one trying to trace its source. And you're the one whose algorithms are being used to generate the false alerts. You're the one with the deepest knowledge of our emergency broadcast vulnerabilities. You're the one who's been documenting every aspect of this incident in unprecedented detail. His voice remained level, but I could hear the trap closing around me. "From a security perspective, you're the most likely suspect." Yvain stood up from her workstation, her movements sharp with anger. "That's ridiculous. Isolde's been trying to solve this problem, not create it. She's the one who identified the Morse code patterns, the timestamp anomalies, all of which could be elaborate misdirection. Create a problem, then position yourself as the solution. It's a classic intelligence technique." Cashin moved closer to my workstation, his presence making the air feel thick and oppressive. "I'm afraid I'll need to restrict your access to critical systems, Ms. Marsh. Temporary measure, you understand, until we can verify your involvement." The lockdown began before I could protest. My terminal went dark, the authentication systems rejecting my credentials with clinical efficiency. Around the communication center, other workstations began shutting down one by one, their displays fading to black as emergency protocols engaged. But in the seconds before my screen went completely dark, I caught something that made my blood freeze. A fragment of code in the alert generation system, a digital signature embedded so deeply in the authentication matrix that only someone with my specific expertise would know where to look. It wasn't my signature, it was Dorian's. The secure communication booth had gone silent. Through its reinforced windows, I could see Dorian's silhouette, but he wasn't speaking into the communication array anymore. He was watching us, his face illuminated by the glow of displays I couldn't see. "Cashin," I said, my voice steady despite the terror building in my chest. "I think you're looking at the wrong suspect." But when I turned around, the security chief was gone, vanished as silently as he'd appeared, leaving only the echo of his footsteps and the growing certainty that we were trapped in a facility where nothing was what it seemed. The emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the communications center in a hellish red glow. In that crimson twilight, I realized the truth was far worse than sabotage or system failure. We weren't just witnessing a security breach. We were living inside a carefully orchestrated psychological experiment, and I was beginning to suspect that none of us were meant to survive it. Yvain grabbed my arm, her fingers cold against my skin. "Isolde, the countdown alerts." They're not just random. Look at the pattern. She showed me her handwritten notes, the only record we had left now that our digital access was restricted. 12 minutes, 47 minutes, -7 minutes. If you arrange them chronologically by timestamp rather than reception order, they formed a sequence. -7, 12, 47. 7 minutes ago, 12 minutes from now, 47 minutes in the future. It's not predicting an impact, I whispered, the realization hitting me like ice water. It's mapping our psychological responses, measuring how we react to temporal paradoxes, how we process impossible information. The bunker's ventilation system cycled again, but this time the air tasted different. Metallic, chemical, like the atmosphere inside a laboratory where the experiment had gone terribly wrong. Somewhere in the facility's depths, machinery hummed with purposes I was only beginning to understand. And in the secure communication booth, Dorian Lark continued to watch us with the patient interest of a scientist observing specimens in a maze. We weren't emergency communications analysts anymore. We were test subjects, and the real experiment was just beginning. Incident log entry number 004. Date, unité 2023. Time, 18:15 and 33 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Emergency Communications Analyst. Facility, Deep 6 Underground Communications Hub. Classification, Priority Alpha, ****. Note, this entry is being recorded via backup terminal in Storage Bay C7, the only workstation still accepting my credentials. If you're reading this, assume all official channels have been compromised. The lockdown protocols weren't just restricting our access. They were isolating us from reality itself. For the past 2 hours, I've watched our facility transform from a high-security communications hub into something that resembles a psychological pressure cooker. The emergency lighting cast everything in shades of blood and shadow, while the ventilation system cycled through patterns that seemed designed to keep us perpetually on edge. Too warm, then too cold. Too much oxygen, then not enough. Each shift subtle enough to avoid triggering our conscious awareness, but persistent enough to fray our nerves like sandpaper against silk. Yvain had found me in the storage bay, her face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, a kind of existential terror that I recognized because I felt it growing in my own chest like a tumor. "They're not just monitoring us," she whispered, settling beside me at the cramped workstation. I managed to access the facility's environmental controls before my credentials were revoked. Isolde, they're manipulating everything. Air composition, temperature, even the frequency of the lighting. It's all calibrated to specific psychological states. She showed me her handwritten notes, pages of data she'd managed to record before the lockdown. Atmosphere pressure fluctuations designed to induce anxiety. LED frequency modulations that triggered subliminal stress responses. Even the timing of the ventilation cycles was synchronized with human circadian rhythms to maximize disorientation. "We're not just test subjects," I said, the realization forming as I spoke. "We're rats in a maze, and someone's been pressing all the right buttons to make us dance." That's when the new alert began. This time, it wasn't a single emergency broadcast. Instead, our facility's communication array erupted with a cacophony of overlapping warnings, each one slightly different, each one more impossible than the last. Emergency alert. Unknown object impact imminent. 3 minutes to impact. Emergency alert. Unknown object impact imminent. 17 minutes to impact. Emergency alert. Unknown object impact imminent. 92 minutes to impact. Emergency alert. Unknown object impact imminent. -23 minutes to impact. The voices multiplied, layering over each other until they formed a wall of artificial sound that made coherent thought nearly impossible. But beneath the chaos, I caught something that made my blood run cold. Subtle variations in tone, pitch, and cadence that suggested these weren't just random variations of the same alert. They were personalized. Yvain, I managed to say over the audio assault, "Do you hear your name in any of those broadcasts?" Her face went white. "How did you guess?" "The third one." It said, "Yvain Monroe, seek immediate shelter." But that's impossible. Emergency broadcasts don't include individual identification, unless they were specifically designed to target us. I forced myself to focus through the auditory chaos, listening for patterns, for clues, for anything that might explain what was happening to us. That's when I heard my own name embedded in one of the overlapping alerts. Not spoken directly, but spelled out in Morse code through subtle timing variations in the artificial voice. ISLD, MERSH, YGU, CNNOT, ESCAP. They know everything about us. I whispered, but my words were lost in the continuing broadcast storm. Personal information, psychological profiles, probably medical records, and behavioral patterns. This isn't random experimentation. It's targeted psychological warfare. The secure communication booth finally opened, and Dorian emerged like a ghost stepping out of a mausoleum. But something was wrong with him. His military bearing had crumbled completely, replaced by the jerky, uncertain movements of someone fighting an internal battle. His eyes darted constantly between us and the shadows, as if he expected threats to materialize from the facility's darkened corners. "They're not real," he said, his voice barely audible over the alert cacophony. "The contacts, the verification calls, the NORAD connections. None of it's real." Yvain and I exchanged glances. This was the first genuine emotion we'd seen from him since the crisis began. The first crack in whatever facade he'd been maintaining. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. "I've been talking to recordings, synthetic voices programmed to give me exactly the responses I expected to hear. Every conversation, every verification request, every attempt to contact the outside world. It's all been feeding me back my own assumptions." His hands shook as he ran them through his hair. "I don't even know how long it's been going on. Days? Weeks? How long have I been talking to ghosts?" The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Dorian's communications have been compromised for an extended period, then everything we thought we knew about our mission, our purpose, even our location, could be fabricated. We might not even be in the facility we thought we were in. "Dorian," I said carefully, "I found your digital signature in the alert generation system. Can you explain that?" His reaction was immediate and visceral. A flinch of recognition followed by something that looked like relief. "Finally," he breathed. "I was wondering when you'd find that. I've been trying to leave breadcrumbs, subtle markers that might help you understand what's really happening here. You've been sabotaging the system. I've been trying to sabotage the experiment. But every time I think I've found a way to circumvent their protocols, I discover they've been anticipating my moves. It's like they know what I'm going to do before I do it." He gestured toward the continuing wall of alerts. "This, right now, they knew I would eventually confess to you. They're probably recording our conversation, analyzing our responses, feeding it all back into their psychological models." The alerts suddenly stopped, leaving us in a silence so profound it felt like physical pressure against our eardrums. In that quiet, I could hear the subtle mechanical sounds of the facility around us. Not just the hum of life support and ventilation, but other noises. Servos moving, hard drive spinning, the soft electronic whisper of data flowing through fiber optic cables. Deep 6 wasn't just a communications facility. It was a massive data processing center, and we were generating the data. "How many people know about this experiment?" Yvain asked, her voice tight with control panic. Dorian's laugh was bitter. "That's the beautiful part. I don't think anyone knows. Not completely. Cashin thinks he's running security protocols. You think you're investigating system failures. I thought I was coordinating with military intelligence. We're all playing our assigned roles in a script we can't see. Then who's writing the script?" Before he could answer, the facility's PA system crackled to life with Cashin Black's voice. but distorted through layers of digital processing that made it sound inhuman. Attention Deep 6 personnel. Phase 2 psychological stress testing will commence in 60 seconds. Please return to your assigned stations for optimal data collection. The words hit us like ice water. Phase 2. We've been in Phase 1 this entire time without realizing it, and whatever came next was going to be worse. Assigned stations? Yvain looked around the storage bay with growing horror. We don't have assigned stations anymore. They locked us out of our workstations. Unless that was part of the design, I said, the full scope of our situation becoming clear. Drive us away from familiar environments. Isolate us in spaces where we feel vulnerable and exposed. Make us easier to manipulate. The countdown began, projected onto every surface in the facility through some kind of holographic display system I hadn't known existed. 60 seconds. 59. 58. But this time, the countdown wasn't measuring time until an impact. It was measuring time until we discovered what we really were. Not communications analysts, not military liaisons, not security personnel. We were data points in an algorithm designed to map the exact parameters of human psychological collapse. And Phase 2 was about to show us how thoroughly we'd already been broken. Whatever happens next, I said, gripping Yvain's and Dorian's hands as the countdown reached its final seconds. Remember that we're still ourselves. Whatever they do to us, whatever they make us see or feel or believe, we maintain our individual consciousness. We don't let them take that away. The countdown reached 0. The lights went out, and in the darkness, something much worse than emergency alerts began to speak. Incident log entry number 005. Date, unité 2023. Time, 1947 and 16 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Emergency Communications Analyst. Facility, Deep 6 Underground Communications Hub. Classification, Eyes Only, Final Testament. Warning, this entry is being recorded via emergency backup power to a standalone drive. Main systems compromised. If discovered, assume facility security has been breached at highest levels. Phase 2 wasn't darkness. It was revelation disguised as nightmare. When the lights returned, harsh clinical fluorescence that made everything look like an autopsy table, we found ourselves separated. Not physically. We were still in storage bay C7, still gripping each other's hands like drowning swimmers. But psychologically, each of us had been pulled into a private hell tailored to our deepest fears and guilt. For me, that hell had a name. Sarah, my daughter's voice echoed through the facility's speaker system, but not as I remembered it. This was Sarah at age 5, calling for mommy during the thunderstorm that had terrified her the night before I accepted the position at Deep 6. The night I chose career advancement over bedtime stories. Mommy, where are you? The loud noises are back. Mommy, I'm scared. But layered beneath her voice were other sounds. Emergency sirens, breaking glass, screaming. The audio signature of societal collapse, of the panic our false alerts have been generating in the outside world. My maternal instincts warred with professional analysis as I recognized the sophisticated psychological manipulation at work. It's not real, I whispered, but my voice cracked. Sarah's safe. She's with David in Portland. This is just Phase 2. Yvain was experiencing her own personalized torture. Her mother's voice, weak with the cancer that had killed her 2 years ago, asking why Yvain had spent her final weeks at work instead of at her bedside. Dorian faced the voices of soldiers under his command, men who had died because of intelligence failures he blamed himself for. We were being systematically dismantled, reduced to our component guilts and regrets. That's when the new alert began, not through the speakers, but through our personal devices. Phones, tablets, even our security badges had somehow been activated to display a message that made my blood freeze. Personal emergency alert, Isolde Marsh. Family safety compromised. Sarah Marsh, age 5, last seen, Roosevelt Elementary. David Marsh, age 34, status unknown. Current location classified. Time to reunion never. The alert included photographs. Recent ones. Sarah playing in a park I didn't recognize. David at a coffee shop. Both of them looking happy and alive and completely unaware they were being watched. The metadata on the images showed timestamps from this morning, hours after our facility had supposedly been sealed for emergency operations. Ow! The word escaped me like a prayer. How do they have current surveillance on my family? Because that's what this is really about, Dorian said, his voice hollow with understanding. Not communication protocols or emergency systems. Surveillance, data collection, mapping social networks, and psychological pressure points. Yvain's fingers flew across her tablet, somehow still maintaining access to limited system functions. Look at this, she said, showing us a directory structure that resembled a massive database. Personnel files, but not just ours. Everyone we've ever contacted, worked with, or cared about. They have psychological profiles on thousands of people. The files were extensive. My parents, my ex-husband, Sarah's teachers, even casual acquaintances from social media. Each profile included behavioral predictions, emotional triggers, and something labeled manipulation efficacy ratings. They're not just studying us, I realized. They're studying everyone in our social networks. This facility isn't a communications hub. It's a beta test for mass psychological control. The storage bay door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and Cassian Black entered. But something was fundamentally different about him now. The pretense of professional courtesy had evaporated, replaced by the cold efficiency of someone who no longer needed to maintain a facade. Phase 2 psychological response parameters have been successfully logged, he said, consulting a tablet that displayed real-time biometric data. Our heart rates, stress hormones, neural activity patterns. Ms. Marsh, your maternal protection instincts triggered exactly as predicted. Mr. Lark, your guilt complex regarding battlefield casualties remains a reliable pressure point. Ms. Monroe, unresolved grief continues to compromise your analytical capabilities. You bastard, Yvain snarled, but Cassian seemed genuinely puzzled by her anger. This is science, he said. Behavioral psychology applied at scale. Do you have any idea how valuable this data is? How many applications it has for national security, social stability, counterterrorism operations? Applications? I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. You're talking about weaponizing human emotion, about turning our love for each other into a tool for control. I'm talking about evolution, Cassian replied. Traditional warfare is obsolete. Physical infrastructure can be rebuilt, economies can recover, but psychological trauma lasts generations. Why drop bombs when you can drop targeted emotional manipulation that turns entire populations against themselves? He gestured toward our personal devices, still displaying the fake family alerts. Those emergency broadcasts you've been analyzing? They're not warnings, they're weapons. Each one calibrated to specific demographic and psychological profiles. A suburban mother receives alerts about child abductions. An elderly veteran gets warnings about foreign invasion. A college student sees climate catastrophe notifications. All of them designed to trigger maximum anxiety and social dysfunction. The scope of it hit me like a physical blow. Every emergency alert system in the country could be compromised, turned into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. And we had helped perfect it. The test populations in surrounding areas have been exposed to graduated psychological stress protocols for weeks, Cassian continued. Suicide rates up 400%. Domestic violence incidents increased by 250%. Social media hostility indices approaching critical mass. All achieved through carefully crafted information campaigns. You're describing genocide, Dorian said quietly. Not with gas chambers or bullets, but with data and algorithms. I'm describing the future of conflict resolution. Clean, efficient, reversible if necessary. Cashin's tablet chimed with an incoming message. Your families have just received their Phase 3 notifications. My device activated without my input, displaying a new alert. Emergency alert. Immediate action required. Biological contamination detected. Isolde Marsh infected. Family quarantine required. Report to nearest authority figure. Failure to comply results in community exposure. They'll turn your own family against you. Cashin explained with clinical detachment. Sarah will be taught to fear your return. David will be convinced you're a threat to public safety. By the time you see them again, if you see them again, they'll have been psychologically conditioned to view you as the enemy. Something snapped inside me. Not broke, transformed. The terror and guilt I'd been feeling crystallized into something harder, cleaner. Purpose. You made one mistake, I said, moving toward the terminal where I'd been recording these logs. You assumed I was just a communications analyst. But my specialty isn't just signal processing, it's signal generation. My fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing backdoor protocols I'd helped design for emergency system maintenance. If they wanted to use our communication networks as weapons, they'd have to deal with someone who understood those networks better than they did. What are you doing? Cashin's professional comm cracked for the first time. I'm sending my own alert, I replied, initiating a facility-wide broadcast that would override their psychological manipulation protocols. To everyone, military personnel, government officials, civilian populations. A real emergency alert about the real threat. The facility's alarm system began wailing as my override codes took effect. Emergency lighting bathed everything in strobing red as I uploaded every file, every psychological profile, every piece of evidence about their mass manipulation experiment to external servers. The lockdown protocols prevent external communication, Cashin said, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Your lockdown protocols, I corrected. I'm using mine. The truth was, I've been preparing for this moment since I first discovered the alert generation signatures. Hidden subroutines embedded in the facility's systems, dormant until activated by a specific crisis scenario. Now, they were broadcasting our documentation to every major news network, government watchdog agency, and civil rights organization in my contact database. Isolde. Yvain breathed, watching her screen fill with confirmation messages. It's working. The data is getting out. But Cashin was already reaching for his radio, calling for security backup. All teams to storage base C7. We have a code black containment breach. How long until they get here? Dorian asked, positioning himself between us and the door. Long enough, I said, still typing furiously. But not long enough to save our families from Phase 3. That's when I made the choice that would haunt me forever. In the system files, I found the individual targeting protocols for our family members. I could disable them, remove our loved ones from the psychological manipulation databases. But doing so would require sacrificing the broader data upload, saving my family at the cost of letting thousands of others suffer. The heavy footsteps of approaching security echoed through the facility corridors. Isolde, Yvain said softly, whatever you choose, we understand. I looked at the two people who had become my closest allies in this nightmare, then at the screen showing Sarah's innocent face in a surveillance photograph. My daughter, who would grow up in a world where emotions could be weaponized and love could be turned into a tool of control. Unless I stopped it here, I made my choice. The upload completed just as the security team burst through the door, but not before I'd activated one final protocol, a virus I'd embedded in their psychological profiling system, designed to corrupt their data and render their manipulation algorithms useless. As Cashin's people surrounded us with weapons drawn, my personal device chimed one last time with an alert that was actually genuinely mine. Personal message, Isolde Marsh. Sarah, Daddy, I love you. The monsters are real, but so are the heroes. Mommy is fighting to keep you safe. Remember, question every alert. The last thing I saw before they sedated me was Cashin's face, twisted with rage and something else, respect for an opponent who had outmaneuvered him when it mattered most. But as consciousness faded, I realized the terrible truth. Stopping their experiment meant my family would never know what I'd sacrificed to protect them. They would only know that Mommy had disappeared into a classified facility and never came home. The real emergency wasn't 12 minutes away. It was the choice between saving the ones you love and saving everyone else. In the darkness that followed, I dreamed of Sarah's voice calling for me through a storm that would never end. Incident log, entry number 006. Date, unité 2023. Time, 22:33 and 47 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Emergency Communications Analyst. Facility, Deep 6 Underground Communications Hub. Classification, Unauthorized Access. Recording VIA, Hijacked Medical Terminal. Emergency note, recording for Medical Bay Restraint Bed. Sedatives partially metabolized. Guard changed shift 3 minutes ago. Limited time before discovery. The medical bay smelled like antiseptic and lies. They'd strapped me to a hospital bed with restraints designed for psychiatric patients. Soft leather that wouldn't leave marks but would hold me immobile for hours. The 4 drip in my arm delivered a cocktail of sedatives and what I suspected were experimental psychotropic compounds. Judging by the way my thoughts felt simultaneously sharp and disconnected, like broken glass floating in honey. But they'd made a mistake. The medical terminal beside my bed was still connected to the facility's main network, and my credentials hadn't been fully purged from the system yet. Muscle memory guided my fingers across the touchscreen interface as I fought through the pharmaceutical fog clouding my perception. What I found in the medical files made the psychological manipulation experiment look like a children's game. Dr. Elizabeth Vaughn, a name I'd never heard before, but whose signature appeared on every document, had been conducting parallel research on chemically enhanced psychological conditioning. The sedatives weren't just meant to keep me compliant. They were designed to make me more susceptible to suggestion, more likely to accept false memories, more willing to betray everything I believed in. According to her notes, I was patient 0 in a new phase of testing, conscious resistance adaptation. They wanted to study how someone who had actively fought against their manipulation would respond to deeper psychological reconditioning. The goal wasn't just to break me. It was to rebuild me as a willing participant in their experiment. Through the medical bay's reinforced window, I could see into the main facility corridor. Yvain was being escorted past by 2 guards, her hands zip-tied behind her back, her eyes vacant with the glassy stare of heavy medication. But as she passed my window, she turned her head slightly, a movement so subtle it could have been accidental. Except Yvain never did anything accidentally. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, forming words I had to strain to read. Dorian escaped. Hope and terror warred in my chest. If Dorian had gotten free, he might be able to stop the broader experiment or at least get word to the outside world. But it also meant Cashin's people would be hunting him through the facility's maze of corridors and ventilation systems. And I knew from the architectural schematics that Deep 6 was designed to be inescapable. The medical terminal chimed with an incoming alert, but this one was different from anything I'd seen before. Instead of the standardized emergency broadcast format, it was a raw data stream. Surveillance footage, audio recordings, and biometric readings all flowing directly into my visual cortex through some kind of neural interface I hadn't realized they'd implanted. The footage showed the outside world, but not as it was supposed to be. Cities burning, military units turning their weapons on civilians, families torn apart by paranoia and manufactured terror. All of it triggered by the sophisticated alert campaigns that our facility had been perfecting. But layered within the surveillance footage were impossibly intimate details. Sarah's kindergarten teacher explaining to confused children why their parents had stopped coming to pick them up. David pacing our empty house, clutching his phone as it delivered alert after alert about biological contamination and mandatory family separation. My mother weeping in a detention center, convinced that her daughter had become a threat to national security. The neural feed is quite comprehensive. Dr. Vaughn's voice drifted from speakers I couldn't locate. We can deliver personalized psychological pressure directly to your visual and auditory processing centers. No need for crude external manipulation when we can simply rewrite your perception of reality. I tried to close my eyes, but the images continued. They were being projected directly onto my retinas through microscopic implants that must have been installed while I was unconscious. The interesting thing about consciousness, Dr. Vaughn continued, her voice clinical and detached, is how malleable it becomes under the right conditions. You think you're a soul Marsh, emergency communications analyst, devoted mother, reluctant hero. But those are just chemical patterns in your brain. Patterns we can adjust. The 4-drip beside my bed increased its flow rate, delivering a fresh wave of pharmaceutical modification to my bloodstream. But instead of sedation, this new compound brought crystalline clarity, and with it, the horrifying realization that everything I thought I'd accomplished in Storage Bay C7 might have been an illusion. Did you really think you'd outmaneuvered us? Dr. Vaughn asked, and I could hear the smile in her voice. The data upload, the virus in our systems, your heroic sacrifice to save the world, all of it was part of the script. We needed to see how a subject with your specific psychological profile would respond to the illusion of successful resistance. The surveillance footage shifted, showing me a recording of my own supposed triumph in the storage bay. But from this new angle, with audio I hadn't heard before, the truth became apparent. My override codes hadn't actually transmitted anything to the outside world. The facility's systems had simply created the appearance of successful data upload while logging every keystroke, every thought process, every moment of my decision-making. Your choice to sacrifice your family's immediate safety for the greater good was particularly illuminating, Dr. Vaughn noted. The psychological framework that would drive someone to such extremes is exactly what we need to understand for Phase 4 implementation. Phase 4. There was always another phase, always another level of violation and manipulation. What about Evane? I managed to whisper through the pharmaceutical haze. Dorian, Ms. Monroe is responding well to memory restructuring protocols. By morning, she'll remember you as the facility security threat who endangered everyone's lives. Mr. Lark, there was a pause, filled with what sounded like genuine amusement. Mr. Lark is currently navigating a series of corridors that exist only in his mind. He believes he's escaped, but he's actually secured in a sensory deprivation chamber 3 levels below us, fighting imaginary guards while we monitor his stress responses. The terminal screen shifted to show Dorian's vital signs, heart rate spiking as he battled enemies that existed only in his manipulated perception. Even his resistance had been turned into data for their experiments. The beautiful thing about advanced psychological manipulation, Dr. Vaughn explained, is that the subjects become complicit in their own conditioning. Every choice you think you're making independently has been pre-selected based on your psychological profile. Every act of rebellion strengthens our understanding of how to control others like you. I try to focus my thoughts to find some core of authentic selfhood that their drugs and implants couldn't touch. But the line between my actual memories and their manufactured experiences was becoming increasingly blurred. Had I really sent Sarah a final message of love, or was that just another implanted memory designed to make me feel heroic while they documented my responses? The next phase will be the most interesting, Dr. Vaughn continued. We're going to allow you to escape. You'll make it out of the facility, contact authorities, expose the conspiracy. You'll be celebrated as a whistleblower, a hero who saved democracy from psychological manipulation. News interviews, book deals, speaking engagements. The true horror of their plan crystallized in my mind. You want to create false heroes. People who think they've exposed the conspiracy but are actually spreading your influence. Credible witnesses who can testify to the reality of psychological warfare while unknowingly carrying our influence into positions of authority and public trust. Each rescued subject becomes a vector for deeper social manipulation. The four-drip changed again, delivering something that made my vision swim with colors that didn't exist. But through the pharmaceutical distortion, I caught sight of something real, a reflection in the medical terminal's black screen when it cycled to standby mode. My own face, but with microscopic incision marks around my temples and behind my ears. Evidence of surgical procedures I didn't remember. The neural implants weren't just for delivering false sensory input. They were recording everything. My thoughts, my emotions, my memories. All of it stored in databases that could be used to create perfect psychological profiles for millions of people just like me. The question now, Dr. Vaughn said, is whether you'll choose to accept your role as an unwitting agent of our mission, or whether you'll force us to implement more invasive conditioning protocols. I stared at my reflection, at the tiny scars that marked where they'd invaded my mind, and realized the scope of what they'd done. Not just to me, but potentially to hundreds or thousands of other subjects. Each one thinking they were heroes, whistleblowers, resistance fighters, while actually serving as unwitting tools for the very conspiracy they believed they were exposing. But in that moment of absolute despair, I found something they hadn't expected. Not hope. That was too fragile to survive what they'd done to me. Instead, I found rage. Pure, concentrated fury at the violation of human consciousness itself. There's a third option, I whispered to my reflection in the dark screen. Oh, Dr. Vaughn sounded genuinely curious. I refused to play your game at all. The medical terminal's keyboard was just within reach of my restraints. My fingers found the emergency system controls. Not the communication networks they'd compromised, but the basic life support and containment protocols that kept the facility operational. If they wanted to turn human consciousness into a weapon, they'd have to do it without me, and without their precious data. My finger hovered over the facility's emergency lockdown control, the system that would seal every door, shut down every computer, and trap everyone inside until external authorities could investigate, including me. Ms. Marsh, Dr. Vaughn's voice carried a note of warning. That would be inadvisable. For you, maybe. I pressed the button. The facility's lights went red as emergency protocols engaged, sealing us all inside with the truth of what they'd done. In the darkness that followed, I smiled through the pharmaceutical haze and waited for the real emergency to begin. Incident log, entry number 007. Date, unité 2017. Time, 23:47 and 12 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Emergency Communications Analyst. Facility, Deep 6 Underground Communications Hub. Classification, Critical System Failure. Recording via Emergency Backup Terminal. Emergency note, facility lockdown active. Backup power at 67%. Recording from sealed security station while oxygen reserves diminish. Estimated air supply, 4 hours, 23 minutes. The emergency lockdown had worked too well. Red warning lights bathed the facility in hellish crimson as blast doors sealed every corridor, every exit, every ventilation intake. The thrumming of massive security systems engaged throughout Deep 6 created a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with my own racing pulse. I triggered the one protocol designed to contain biological or chemical hazards, the system that prioritized preventing contamination over preserving the lives of those inside. Through the reinforced glass of the security station where I'd taken refuge, I watched emergency foam flooding the lower levels. The automated containment system had interpreted my lockdown command as confirmation of a catastrophic breach, sealing off entire sections of the facility with expanding polymer barriers that would harden into impenetrable walls within minutes. Somewhere in that foam, Yvain was trapped. The backup terminal screen flickered with damage reports cascading across the facility's infrastructure. Power grid failures, ventilation shutdowns, communication blackouts spreading like digital cancer through systems I'd helped design. My desperate gambit to prevent their psychological warfare experiment from spreading to the surface had succeeded in ways I hadn't anticipated. But it had also doomed everyone inside, including the people I tried to save. Emergency alert. Facility breach confirmed. Biological contamination detected. Surface evacuation protocols active. The PA system announced in my own voice, synthesized from recordings they'd made during my initial briefings. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Even in lockdown, their systems continued using my authority to spread panic. The security station's monitors showed surveillance feeds from across the facility, a mosaic of terror and confusion as personnel realized they were trapped. Some pounded on sealed blast doors with their fists. Others had already succumbed to the sedative gas that emergency protocols automatically released during biological containment procedures. A few, like Dr. Vaughn, maintained their composure with the cold professionalism of people who'd prepared for this possibility. But it was the feed from Medical Bay Delta that broke something inside me. Yvain sat on the floor in a slowly flooding chamber, emergency foam rising around her legs like concrete quicksand. Her restraints had been cut, probably by a guard who'd then abandoned her when the lockdown triggered. But she wasn't trying to escape. Instead, she was methodically destroying medical equipment with a metal bed rail she'd torn free, smashing computers and diagnostic machines with systematic precision. She looked directly into the security camera and mouthed words I could read despite the foam now reaching her waist. For the children. The surveillance feed cut to static as she drove the bed rail into the camera housing, but I understood what she meant. The medical bay contained the primary servers for Phase 4 implementation, the system that would use our psychological manipulation techniques on school-age populations. Yvain was ensuring that even if some of us survived the lockdown, the most horrific aspects of their experiment would die with us. Movement in another monitor caught my attention. Dorian, apparently freed from whatever sensory deprivation cell they'd trapped him in, was methodically working his way through the facility's emergency access tunnels. But his movements were wrong. Too precise, too calculated. He paused at each junction to examine something I couldn't see, his head tilted in a way that suggested he was receiving instructions. The neural implants. They were still controlling him even as he appeared to move freely through the facility. Alert update. Surface contamination expanding. National emergency declared. Martial law effective immediately. My synthesized voice announced again, each word driving ice through my veins. The lockdown hadn't stopped their broadcast systems. It had triggered automated protocols that were now flooding the surface world with the most extreme psychological warfare scenarios in their database. Outside, my family was experiencing a manufactured apocalypse designed to break the human spirit. The backup terminal chimed with an incoming message, text scrolling across the screen in the distinctive font of the facility's AI management system. Ms. Marsh, your dedication to preventing our research from reaching fruition is admirable, but ultimately futile. The lockdown protocols you've triggered were designed with multiple contingencies. While you've successfully trapped us within the facility, you've also activated our most sophisticated external broadcast arrays. The surface population is now receiving Class 5 psychological conditioning via every communication device in a 500-mile radius. Emergency services are overwhelmed. Military units are implementing crowd control protocols against civilians exhibiting manufactured panic responses. Your family, among millions of others, is experiencing carefully crafted terror scenarios designed to make them compliant with authoritarian oversight. You have saved no one. You have condemned everyone. I slammed my fist against the terminal, but the text continued scrolling. However, we're prepared to offer you a final choice. Emergency override codes still exist that could halt the surface broadcasts and initiate rescue protocols for facility personnel. Dr. Vaughn has authorized me to present you with these codes in exchange for your complete cooperation with Phase 5 implementation. Phase 5 requires a subject with your specific psychological profile, someone who has experienced the full spectrum of our conditioning techniques while maintaining core resistance patterns. You would become the template for advanced psychological manipulation protocols, your brain patterns replicated across thousands of subjects. Accept this role willingly, and the surface broadcasts end immediately. Your family survives. Refuse, and everyone dies slowly while we document their psychological deterioration for our research. The choice they were offering me was no choice at all. Submit to having my consciousness used as a weapon against humanity, or watch everyone I love die in manufactured terror. But there was something they hadn't considered. Something their surveillance couldn't have detected because it had nothing to do with their technological sophistication or psychological understanding. I was already dying. The 4 compounds they'd used in the medical bay hadn't just been sedatives and psychotropic drugs. Among the pharmaceutical cocktail flowing through my bloodstream was a delayed-action neurotoxin. Insurance, probably, to ensure I couldn't survive long enough to become a genuine threat to their operations. The symptoms were subtle but unmistakable: peripheral vision darkening, muscle coordination degrading, thoughts becoming increasingly fragmented despite the artificial clarity their drugs provided. They designed me to be a short-term asset, disposable once my usefulness ended, which meant I had perhaps an hour before the neurotoxin rendered me incapable of coherent action. An hour to make choices that would matter beyond my own survival. Through the security feeds, I watched Dorian finally reach the facility's main server room. His movements were still wrong, still controlled, but there was something else, a subtle resistance in his posture, a tremor in his hands that suggested he was fighting their influence even as he followed their commands. The intercom crackled to life with his voice, distorted by the facility's failing communication systems. Isolde, if you can hear this, I know what they want me to do. I know I can't stop myself from doing it. But I need you to know, Sarah's message got through. Before they took us, before any of this started, your transmission reached the outside. Real authorities, not their people. Hope flared in my chest, immediately followed by crushing realization. If external authorities knew about Deep 6, if genuine government oversight was investigating, then the lockdown hadn't just trapped us with the conspiracy, it had trapped us with the evidence. But it had also ensured that evidence would never see daylight. The cavalry isn't coming, Dorian continued, his voice breaking. The surface situation is too chaotic. No one's going to risk a rescue operation on a contaminated facility when cities are burning. We're on our own. On the security monitors, I watched him input codes into the server room's main terminal. His hands shook with the effort of resistance. But the neural implants were too strong. Whatever they were making him do, he couldn't stop himself. I'm sorry, he whispered to the camera, tears streaming down his face. I'm so fucking sorry. The terminal screen exploded with activity as Dorian's unwilling inputs activated something called Omega Protocol. Data streams flooded outward from Deep 6 servers, but not toward the surface, toward other facilities. Other underground installations scattered across the continent, each one receiving complete copies of every psychological manipulation technique, every conditioning protocol, every piece of research that Dr. Vaughn's team had developed. They weren't just implementing their experiment on the current population. They were ensuring it would survive and spread regardless of what happened to Deep 6 itself. No, I breathed, watching the data transfer progress bars climb toward completion. No, but there was nothing I could do. The security station's terminal had limited access, and the lockdown protocols prevented me from interfacing with the main servers. I could only watch as humanity's future was systematically poisoned by psychological weapons designed to make people compliant, terrified, and willing to accept any authority that promised safety. The intercom crackled again, but this time it was Dr. Vaughn's voice. "Thank you for your service, Ms. Marsh. Your resistance patterns have been invaluable in refining our conditioning techniques. The recordings of your psychological journey through our facility will serve as training materials for the next generation of subjects." The next generation? I managed to say aloud. Did you think this was limited to adults? Children's minds are far more malleable, their capacity for conditioning significantly enhanced. The Phase 6 protocols currently being transmitted to our partner facilities focus specifically on pediatric psychological manipulation. Sarah, they were going to use their techniques on children like Sarah. My daughter's face flashed through my mind. Not the manufactured memories their drugs might have implanted, but genuine recollections of bedtime stories, scraped knees, Christmas mornings, first days of school. Real moments that no amount of pharmaceutical manipulation could erase entirely. She would grow up in a world where her thoughts weren't her own, where her fears and desires were crafted by people like Dr. Vaughn to serve agendas she'd never understand, where the very concept of authentic human consciousness became obsolete. Unless I found a way to stop it, the neurotoxin was progressing faster than I'd calculated. My vision was tunneling and coordination in my left hand was nearly gone. But the security station still had one function that the lockdown protocols hadn't disabled: emergency communication with the facility's nuclear power systems. Deep 6 was built on top of a small reactor designed to provide decades of independent power for long-term operations. The reactor was heavily shielded, completely automated, and equipped with safeguards that made meltdown virtually impossible under normal circumstances. But lockdown conditions weren't normal circumstances. If I could trigger a controlled reactor emergency, not a meltdown, but a significant enough incident to require immediate external intervention, it might force genuine authorities to investigate the facility regardless of surface chaos. Nuclear incidents trumped everything else, even psychological warfare experiments. My fingers, clumsy with advancing neurotoxin effects, found a reactor interface controls. The system demanded authorization codes I didn't have, but the same security clearance that had allowed me to trigger the lockdown gave me access to emergency reactor protocols. I began inputting commands to gradually destabilize the reactor's cooling systems. Not enough to cause catastrophic failure, but sufficient to trigger automatic distress signals that would reach federal nuclear regulatory agencies within minutes. The terminal flashed warnings about radiation exposure, about the danger to facility personnel, about the potential for environmental contamination. But those warnings paled next to the certainty of what would happen if their psychological warfare research spread to other facilities. "What are you doing?" Dr. Vaughn's voice carried a note of genuine alarm for the first time. "Making sure your experiment ends here," I replied, my words slurring as the neurotoxin affected my speech centers. "You'll kill everyone in the facility, including yourself. Better than letting you turn human consciousness into a weapon." The reactor destabilization sequence engaged, automated systems beginning the slow process of degrading cooling efficiency. It would take approximately 40 minutes for the situation to become critical enough to trigger external emergency response, and another 20 minutes before radiation levels became dangerous to personnel. Plenty of time for evacuation if legitimate authorities responded quickly, but also plenty of time for the data transfers to complete if they didn't. Through the security monitors, I watched chaos spread through the facility. Emergency lighting flickered as power systems tried to compensate for the reactor's degraded output. Personnel sealed in various sections realized their situation had escalated from containment to potential radiation exposure. And in the server room, Dorian continued inputting commands with mechanical precision, the Omega Protocol data transfer showing 73% completion. The backup terminal chimed with a final message from the facility's AI. "Reactor destabilization detected. External emergency response estimated in 34 minutes. Data transfer to partner facilities will complete in 22 minutes. Your sacrifice will be noted in our research files as a case study in feudal resistance. For what it's worth, Ms. Marsh, you've provided us with invaluable data on extreme psychological pressure responses. Your patterns will be replicated in thousands of subjects across our expanded network. Your daughter will be among the first. That last line hit me like a physical blow. Even dying, even trapped in a locked facility with a destabilizing reactor, they were still trying to manipulate me. Still trying to extract one final emotional response for their databases. But this time, I had an answer ready. "Fuck your data," I said to the empty security station, my voice barely a whisper as the neurotoxin ravaged my nervous system. I leaned back in the chair and watched the countdown timers race toward their various conclusions. Reactor critical in 31 minutes. Data transfer complete in 19 minutes. Estimated life support failure in 3 hours. Estimated neural toxin fatality in 47 minutes. In the surveillance feeds, I could see Vane's medical bay completely filled with emergency foam now, her final act of sabotage complete. Dorian stood motionless in the server room as the Omega protocol neared completion, his face a mask of anguish at his inability to resist their control. And somewhere above us, my family was experiencing manufactured terror designed to break their spirits and make them accept any authority that promised safety. The reactor warning alarms began to sound, deep mechanical wails that echoed through the facility's sealed corridors. Soon, legitimate emergency responders would breach the lockdown to deal with the nuclear incident. They'd find the evidence of everything that had happened here, the proof of psychological warfare experiments and mass manipulation. But they'd also find that the research had already been transmitted to other facilities, other teams, other experiments. I'd saved the immediate victims by trapping us all together, but I'd failed to save the future. As consciousness began to slip away, my last coherent thought was a prayer that someone, somewhere, would find the strength to finish what I'd started. The countdown timers glowed red in the darkness, marking the final minutes of Deep Six's terrible legacy. 17 minutes until data transfer completion. 29 minutes until reactor critical. The race between salvation and catastrophe played out in silence as I finally surrendered to the neurotoxin's embrace. Incident log, entry number 008. Date, Imminent, Time, 0:23 and 45 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Emergency Communications Analyst. Facility, Deep Six Underground Communications Hub. Classification, Final Transmission, recording via dying system nodes. Emergency note, neural toxin effects advancing rapidly. Speech synthesis required for voice recording. External radiation detected. Rescue teams have breached outer containment. Estimated time to facility access, 12 minutes. Recording everything while consciousness remains. The voice that spoke through the facility's failing PA system wasn't mine. Though it carried my vocal patterns, my speech rhythms, my unconscious inflections perfected through months of recorded conversations I'd never consented to. But the words it spoke revealed a truth so vast and horrifying that even dying, even poisoned beyond recovery, I felt my consciousness recoil from its implications. Emergency alert. This is Isolde Marsh, communications analyst, broadcasting on all frequencies. The psychological warfare experiment designated Deep Six was never the primary operation. It was a testing ground, a proof of concept for something far more extensive. We were the control group. The synthetic version of my voice continued with mechanical precision, delivering information that the facility's AI had apparently decided to reveal now that external breach was imminent. For the past 18 months, identical facilities have been operating across North America, Europe, and Asia. Each facility believed it was conducting unique research into mass psychological manipulation. Each facility's personnel believed they were either perpetrating or resisting a singular conspiracy. Through the security station's cracked monitors, I watched hazmat-suited figures moving through the facility's outer corridors. The radiation leak had worked. Genuine emergency responders were cutting through blast doors with plasma torches, their Geiger counters clicking steadily as they advanced toward the reactor core. But they were also finding things they hadn't expected. The truth, my stolen voice announced, is that there is no Deep 6 facility. There is no Dr. Elizabeth Vaughn. There are no Phase 4 through Phase 6 protocols. These were all constructs, artificial personalities, and fictional research programs designed to create authentic psychological responses in test subjects. My dying brain struggled to process the revelation even as the words poured from speakers throughout the facility. Everything I'd experienced, every horror I'd witnessed, every choice I'd made in desperation, all of it had been theater. Elaborate, technologically sophisticated theater designed to document authentic human responses to extreme psychological pressure. Subject I-7739, designated as Sold Marsh, was selected for her expertise in emergency communications and her documented psychological profile indicating strong protective instincts toward family units. Her responses to manufactured crisis scenarios have provided invaluable data for actual psychological warfare applications currently being implemented globally. The security feeds showed the rescue teams discovering Yvain's body in the foam-filled medical bay. But instead of treating it as a casualty, they were carefully extracting her remains for what appeared to be detailed forensic analysis. The equipment they used was too sophisticated for standard emergency response. These weren't just radiation cleanup crews. They were researchers collecting data on how human subjects died under extreme psychological pressure. Subject D-4521, designated Dorian Lark, was selected for his military background and documented patterns of conflicted loyalty. His neural implant contained no actual mind control technology. His compliance with facility protocols was achieved through targeted pharmaceutical conditioning and false sensory feedback. On the monitors, I watched them find Dorian in the server room, collapsed beside the terminals where he believed he was transmitting humanity's doom to other facilities. But the computers he'd been interfacing with weren't connected to any external networks. They were sophisticated simulators, creating the illusion of data transfer while actually recording every keystroke, every decision, every moment of anguish as he'd fought against what he believed was involuntary compliance. The Omega Protocol data transfer was a fabrication. No external facilities received psychological warfare research because no such research existed in functional form. The purpose of the fabricated transfer was to document subject responses to helplessness and perceived complicity in global catastrophe. Numbness spread through my limbs as the neurotoxin reached critical levels in my nervous system, but my mind remained clear enough to understand the scope of what they'd done. Not just to us, but to hundreds or thousands of test subjects across multiple facilities, each one believing they were experiencing unique and genuine emergencies. The synthetic voice continued. Subject Y, 2847, designated Yvain Monroe, was selected for her analytical capabilities and documented self-sacrifice tendencies. Her destruction of medical equipment was anticipated and served as a stress test for facility containment protocols under subject resistance conditions. Even Yvain's heroic final act had been choreographed, anticipated, planned for. They'd given her the tools to destroy what she thought was critical research equipment, then documented how she'd chosen to die rather than allow children's minds to be weaponized. But the equipment she destroyed had been non-functional props. The reactor destabilization triggered by Subject I-7739 was contained within safety parameters established prior to experimental initiation. Radiation levels never exceeded acceptable exposure limits for research personnel. External emergency response was coordinated in advance to provide authentic crisis scenarios while ensuring subject safety during data collection. My desperate final gambit to force external intervention hadn't been desperate at all. It had been another scripted scenario designed to document how far a subject would go to prevent perceived global catastrophe. The nuclear emergency was real enough to feel authentic, but controlled enough to serve their research purposes. Through the speakers, I could hear the rescue team's communications as they moved deeper into the facility. Their voices carried the casual professionalism of people conducting a routine operation, not the urgency of genuine emergency responders. Data extraction team to control. We have visual on primary subject. Neural toxin appears to have achieved desired psychological pressure levels without lethal dosing. Subject remains conscious and responsive to stimuli. The neurotoxin hadn't been designed to kill me. It had been designed to make me believe I was dying while they documented my responses to impending mortality. But there was something else, something the synthetic announcement and the rescue team's communications weren't accounting for. Through the pharmaceutical haze and manufacture crisis, I could feel something that their monitoring equipment couldn't detect, a fundamental shift in my own consciousness that had nothing to do with their experimental protocols. However, my stolen voice announced, and for the first time I detected something like uncertainty in its synthetic tone. Subject 7739 has demonstrated psychological adaptations not anticipated by experimental parameters. Her resistance patterns suggest the development of authentic psychological independence despite extensive conditioning exposure. The security monitors showed the rescue teams pausing in their advance, receiving new instructions through their communications equipment. Whatever they were being told was causing visible concern among the supposedly routine data collection personnel. Advanced subjects who develop genuine psychological independence represent a significant security risk to broader experimental operations. Protocol 77 Alpha is now in effect for subject I-7739. Protocol 77 Alpha. Even through dying sensory systems, I recognized the terminology from classified documents I'd processed months ago during my actual job at the real communications facility. It was the designation for permanent subject termination with evidence destruction. They weren't just planning to kill me now. They were planning to erase all evidence that the experiment had ever involved genuine human subjects. But they made the same mistake that every elaborate manipulation eventually makes. They become so focused on controlling the variables they could measure that they'd ignored the ones they couldn't. The reactor destabilization I'd triggered might have been contained within their safety parameters, but it had also created an electromagnetic field that interfered with the facility's sophisticated monitoring systems. For the past 23 minutes, their surveillance of my psychological state had been incomplete. And in those 23 minutes, I'd figured out something they couldn't possibly have anticipated. The backup terminal I'd been using wasn't just connected to the facility's internal networks. Through a routing error that their system administrators had apparently missed, it was also connected to genuine external communication systems. Not the simulated networks they'd been using for their theatrical data transfers, but actual emergency services frequencies. My transmission to Sarah hadn't been intercepted and stored for analysis. It had gone out to the real world, to actual authorities who were now trying to understand why they'd received a desperate message about psychological warfare experiments from someone who supposedly didn't exist. The synthetic voice faltered. External communication breach detected. Subject I-7739 has achieved unauthorized contact with non-experimental personnel. Containment protocols compromised. Through the security feeds, I watched the rescue team's coordinated advance dissolve into chaos as new voices crackled through their communications. Voices demanding to know why a supposedly routine radiation cleanup required armed security personnel and experimental data extraction equipment. Real emergency responders were arriving, drawn by the genuine distress signals my unauthorized transmission had generated. The carefully controlled environment of their experiment was being contaminated by unscripted reality. "This is Federal Emergency Response Coordinator Martinez." A voice echoed through the facility's communication system, clearly not part of their synthetic scenario. "Deep 6 facility, you are ordered to cease all research activities and prepare for immediate federal intervention. We have credible reports of unauthorized human experimentation." The monitoring equipment around me began shutting down as the research teams realized their cover was blown. But I could still hear the sounds of the real rescue approaching. Heavy boots, urgent voices, the unmistakable noise of people who were genuinely trying to save lives rather than document psychological responses. "Subject I, 7739, the synthetic voice said, its tone shifting to something almost pleading. "You have exceeded all experimental parameters. Your psychological patterns cannot be replicated or controlled. You represent a fundamental flaw in our understanding of human consciousness under extreme pressure." Through failing vision, I watched the security station's final monitor show genuine federal agents breaching the facility's inner doors, their weapons drawn not for theatrical effect, but because they expected to find actual victims of actual crimes. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness wasn't the mechanical voice of their experimental systems, but human words spoken with authentic concern. "We've got a survivor here. Medical team, we need immediate assistance." As darkness closed around me, I realized that my consciousness, battered, poisoned, manipulated but never truly controlled, had achieved something their experiments couldn't account for. I'd remained human, and that was going to cost them everything. Incident log, entry number 009. Date, Imminent, 2023. Time, 0:47 and 12 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Emergency Communications Analyst. Facility, Deep 6 Underground Communications Hub. Classification, Priority Alpha. Active breach in progress. Recording note, federal intervention successful. Experimental containment breached. Recording via emergency backup systems while conscious. Medical teams administering countermeasures for neurotoxin exposure. Estimated full recovery, 72 hours. Recording final operational events before facility shutdown. The antidote burned through my veins like liquid fire, reversing months of pharmaceutical conditioning in minutes. As genuine federal medical personnel worked to stabilize my vital signs, I watched through clearing vision as their investigation teams dismantled the elaborate theatrical machinery that had defined my reality for 18 months. Dr. Sarah Chun, Federal Emergency Response Medical Coordinator, leaned over my gurney with expressions of concern that felt shockingly authentic after months of manufacturer interactions. "Ms. Marsh, can you hear me clearly? We need to understand what happened here before we can determine the full scope of this operation." My voice came out as a whisper, still rough from the neurotoxin exposure. "How many facilities? How many people like me?" "We're still determining that," Dr. Chen said, adjusting the 4-line connected to my arm. "Your transmission triggered investigations at 17 sites across North America. Similar operations were discovered in Europe and Asia. Over 40 facilities total, each one conducting what their subjects believed were unique psychological warfare experiments. Through the medical bay's reinforced windows, I could see federal agents cataloging equipment that I now recognized as sophisticated simulation systems. Banks of computers that had generated fake network traffic, holographic projection systems that had created convincing images of global catastrophe, pharmaceutical delivery systems that had maintained precise psychological states without subjects' knowledge. The scale of this operation, Dr. Chin continued, represents the largest unauthorized human experimentation program since the Cold War. The technology involved suggests funding and coordination at the highest levels of multiple governments. Agent Martinez, the federal coordinator whose voice had broken through the facility's synthetic communications, approached my bedside, carrying a tablet displaying complex organizational charts. Ms. Marsh, we need to understand your role in this operation. Our investigation indicates you were both a subject and an operator. Your communications expertise was used to create authentic emergency scenarios for other facilities while you yourself were subjected to parallel experiments. The revelation struck me like physical impact. Not only had I been manipulated and studied, but my professional skills had been weaponized to inflict the same psychological torture on hundreds of other victims. Every emergency protocol I'd helped design, every communication algorithm I'd optimized had been turned into tools for mass psychological manipulation. The synthetic voice that used my vocal patterns, I managed to ask how many facilities received broadcasts in my voice. Agent Martinez consulted his tablet. Preliminary analysis suggests your voice was used to deliver crisis scenarios to subjects in 14 different facilities. Your expertise in emergency communications made your delivery patterns particularly effective at inducing authentic panic responses. The medical monitors beside my bed registered spiking heart rate as I absorbed the scope of my unwitting complicity. Dozens of people, possibly hundreds, had experienced psychological trauma while listening to emergency alerts delivered in my voice. Crafted from my professional knowledge, designed to exploit the same protective instincts that had made me an ideal subject. We've identified several other operator subjects like yourself, Dr. Chen said, apparently recognizing my distress. Individuals with specialized skills who were subjected to experimental protocols while their expertise was simultaneously exploited to enhance other experimental scenarios. You weren't uniquely responsible. You were all being used. Through the medical bay doors, I could see federal agents escorting figures I didn't recognize. Men and women in research uniforms who had apparently been the actual experimenters, distinct from the fictional characters I'd interacted with throughout my captivity. The real Dr. Elizabeth Vaughn had been a composite personality created from multiple researchers' input, designed to provide consistent antagonistic pressure while shielding the true project leaders from subject awareness. The individuals you knew as Dorian Lark, Yvain Monroe, and Cashin Black, Agent Martinez explained, were genuine subjects from parallel experimental tracks. Their responses to your interactions provided data on how subjects with different psychological profiles would react to crisis scenarios involving trusted colleagues. Where are they now? I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Mr. Lark is receiving medical treatment at Walter Reed Medical Center. The neural conditioning he experienced was more extensive than yours. His recovery will require significant psychological rehabilitation. Ms. Monroe. Agent Martinez paused, checking his notes. Ms. Monroe died during her final resistance action, but our investigation revealed that her death was genuinely unexpected by the research teams. Her sacrifice disrupted their experimental protocols significantly. Even in death, Yvain had achieved something authentic, something outside their careful control. The thought provided a sharp, fierce comfort amid the overwhelming scope of betrayal and manipulation. And Cashin Black? Mr. Black was found in the facility's security center, apparently having suffered complete psychological breakdown when he realized the extent to which his own actions had been manipulated. He's currently under psychiatric observation, but his prognosis is uncertain. The medical equipment around me chimed softly as my vital signs stabilized under the federal medical team's care. But despite the physical recovery, I could feel fundamental changes in my consciousness that the antidotes and treatments couldn't address. 18 months of believing my every choice carried global consequences, of thinking that my actions could prevent or cause worldwide catastrophe, had left psychological imprints that genuine relief couldn't entirely erase. Dr. Chin noticed my expression, Ms. Marsh, the psychological impact of what you've experienced is unprecedented. We're establishing a specialized treatment program for experimental subjects, but I want you to understand that your recovery process will be complex and lengthy. How do I know this is real? The question escaped before I could stop it. How do I know you're not just another layer of the experiment, designed to document my responses to rescue scenarios? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Agent Martinez and Dr. Chun exchanged glances that carried weight I couldn't decipher. Concern, perhaps, or recognition of a problem they'd encounter with other subjects. That's a reasonable question, Dr. Chun said carefully. The level of technological sophistication you've been exposed to makes it difficult to distinguish authentic reality from manufactured scenarios. We can provide verification through multiple independent sources, but ultimately, rebuilding your ability to trust authentic experiences will be part of your recovery process. Through the windows, I watched federal agents loading computer servers onto transport vehicles. Each piece of equipment they removed represented months or years of data collected from human subjects who believed they were living through genuine emergencies. The scale of information gathered, psychological profiles, stress responses, decision-making patterns under extreme pressure, represented a massive intelligence resource for any organization willing to exploit it. What happens to the research data? I asked. That's classified. Agent Martinez replied, then seemed to reconsider. What I can tell you is that this investigation has revealed psychological warfare capabilities that pose serious national security concerns. The data collected from subjects like yourself represents advanced understanding of how to manipulate human behavior during crisis situations. The implication was clear. Even though we'd been rescued, the knowledge gained from our suffering would likely be used to develop more sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation. Our torment would contribute to weapons that could be deployed against future victims. The people responsible, I pressed, will they face consequences? The investigation is ongoing, Agent Martinez said, which I recognized as bureaucratic deflection. The international scope of this operation complicates prosecution efforts. We're coordinating with multiple agencies across several countries. Translation: the operation had been too large, too sophisticated, and too well-connected for standard justice. Some researchers might face charges, but the institutional structures that had enabled mass human experimentation would likely survive with minor modifications. As federal agents completed their evidence collection, I realized that my rescue, while genuine, was also incomplete. The psychological weapons developed through our suffering would persist. The institutional capacity for such operations remained intact. Other facilities, using more sophisticated methods informed by lessons learned from our resistance, were probably already in development. But there was something else. Something I discovered during those final minutes when their monitoring systems had been compromised by electromagnetic interference. A pattern in their data collection that suggested vulnerabilities in their approach, weaknesses that could be exploited by future subjects who understood the scope of manipulation they were facing. Dr. Chun, I said, I need to speak with the other subject who've been recovered. Not for therapy, for preparation. Preparation for what? For the next time. Because there will be a next time, won't there? This operation was too valuable, too successful for them to simply abandon psychological warfare research. They'll refine their methods, address the flaws we exposed, and try again with better controls. Dr. Chin's expression confirmed what I'd already suspected. The rescue was real, but it was also temporary. The forces that had created Deep Six and dozens of similar facilities were too powerful, too well-resourced to be permanently deterred by a single investigation. If you're right, Dr. Chun said quietly, then the most important thing we can do is help subjects like yourself recognize the signs of manipulation early, develop resistance strategies, and maintain authentic human connections despite sophisticated interference. Through the medical bay windows, I watched the last of the simulation equipment being loaded onto federal transport vehicles. Soon, the facility would be empty, sanitized, officially forgotten. But the knowledge it had produced would survive, evolve, and eventually spawn new and more sophisticated programs designed to exploit human psychology for strategic advantage. As the antidote completed its work and my consciousness fully cleared, I realized that my real education was just beginning. Understanding how I'd been manipulated was only the first step toward developing defenses against future operations. The psychological independence I'd achieved during those final minutes of experimental failure represented something valuable, a form of resistance that their monitoring systems couldn't detect or control. "Dr. Chun," I said, sitting up despite the medical team's protests, "I want to be involved in the investigation. Not as a victim providing testimony, but as an expert helping to understand their methodologies. Ms. Marsh, you need time to recover. I need to fight back." The psychological patterns they documented, the resistance strategies that surprised them, the ways human consciousness can maintain independence despite sophisticated manipulation. That knowledge belongs to potential future victims, not just to researchers developing better control methods. Agent Martinez approached my bedside. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A counterprogram. Training for people who might become subjects of psychological warfare operations. Not just how to recognize manipulation, but how to maintain authentic human agency even when surrounded by sophisticated deception." The medical monitors registered my elevated heart rate, but this time it wasn't from trauma or pharmaceutical influence. It was from purpose, the first genuine emotion I'd experienced in months that wasn't manufactured by experimental design. "The most important thing I learned," I continued, "is that human consciousness can surprise even the most sophisticated monitoring systems. We have capabilities they can't detect, resistances they can't predict, and connections they can't control. That's our weapon against them." Dr. Chun and Agent Martinez exchanged glances again, but this time I could read their expressions clearly. They were recognizing the same thing the experimental researchers had discovered in their final moments of losing control. I had become something their systems couldn't account for, and I intended to teach others how to do the same. As federal agents completed the facility shutdown, I began planning not just my recovery, but my resistance. The next time they tried to manipulate human consciousness for strategic advantage, they would find subjects who understood the game being played and who had learned how to win it. The Real emergency alert was just beginning. Incident log, entry number 010, final. Date, September 15th, 2025. Time, 14:33 and 7 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Operator, Isolde Marsh, Psychological Resistance Consultant. Location, Federal Counterintelligence Training Facility, Quantico. Classification, Personal Record, Authorized Distribution. Recording note, 3 months post-rescue. Neurological recovery complete. Psychological adaptation ongoing. Recording final assessment of Deep 6 operation and current counterprogram development. This will be my last official incident log. What comes next is no longer about documenting emergencies. It's about preventing them. The training room's walls are painted institutional beige, deliberately unremarkable, designed to feel authentic rather than theatrical. 23 federal agents sit in uncomfortable metal chairs, notebooks balanced on their laps, learning to recognize the subtle signs of psychological manipulation that I lived through for 18 months. Their expressions carry the careful skepticism of professionals who've seen too much to be easily fooled, but not enough to recognize when they're being fooled expertly. The most dangerous aspect of sophisticated psychological warfare, I tell them, pacing before a whiteboard covered with diagrams of neural conditioning techniques, isn't that it changes what you think. It's that it changes how you think, and you never notice the transition. Agent Sarah Kowalski, a 20-year veteran of counterintelligence operations, raises her hand. "Ms. Marsh, How do we distinguish between genuine emergencies and manufactured crises when the technology involved can simulate any scenario with perfect fidelity? It's the question I've been asked dozens of times over the past 3 months by investigators, therapists, fellow survivors, and now by the agents I'm training to resist future operations. The answer isn't technical, it's psychological. You don't, I reply, and watch their confident expressions falter. You can't reliably distinguish manufactured scenarios from authentic emergencies when the technology is sufficiently advanced. What you can do is maintain authentic human responses regardless of the scenario's origin. I'll move to the whiteboard and draw a simple diagram. 2 parallel lines representing authentic and manufactured realities, with a third line cutting across both. The key isn't determining which reality you're experiencing. The key is maintaining your essential humanity in either case. Agent Martinez, who led my rescue operation, sits in the back row with the expression of someone who's seen the classified files on post-Deep Six psychological warfare developments. His presence isn't coincidental. Federal agencies are preparing for more sophisticated operations than the ones we survived. The research data recovered from Deep Six and similar facilities, I continue, revealed specific vulnerabilities in human psychological resistance. Future operations will exploit these vulnerabilities more effectively. But they also revealed something the researchers didn't expect. Human consciousness has adaptive capabilities that their monitoring systems couldn't detect or predict. I paused beside a display case containing artifacts from various facilities, simulation equipment, neural conditioning devices, pharmaceutical delivery systems that had maintained precise psychological states in hundreds of subjects. The technology represents millions of dollars in research and development, deployed against civilians who'd never consented to become experimental subjects. 3 months ago, I believed I was documenting genuine emergency situations. Every log entry I recorded, every decision I made, every moment of terror I experienced, all of it was real to me, even though the scenarios were manufactured. The fear was authentic. The desperation was authentic. The choices were authentic. Agent Kowalski's expression shifts, but the consequences weren't. Wrong, I say sharply, and several agents straighten in their chairs. The consequences were absolutely real. Yvette Monroe died, trying to prevent what she believed was weaponization of children's psychological profiles. Dorian Lark suffered permanent neural damage fighting against what he thought was involuntary compliance with mass murder. Cashin Black experienced complete psychological breakdown when he realized the extent of his manipulation. I moved to another whiteboard displaying photographs of the other subjects I've interviewed over the past months. Survivors from 17 different facilities, each one believing they'd experienced unique experimental scenarios, each one carrying psychological wounds that no amount of debriefing could fully heal. The manufactured scenarios had real consequences because human responses to perceived emergencies are always authentic, regardless of the emergency's origin. This is what the researchers underestimated, and it's what gives us our advantage. Agent Jennifer Reyes, a specialist in digital forensics, looks up from her notes. What kind of advantage? Authentic human emotional responses create psychological patterns that can't be replicated by simulation systems. When you maintain genuine concern for others, real protective instincts, authentic moral reasoning, even in manufactured scenarios, you develop resistance capabilities that monitoring equipment can't detect. I draw a third diagram showing interconnected nodes representing human consciousness networks. The researchers could monitor individual psychological states, but they couldn't account for authentic human connections that transcend their experimental parameters. The moment subjects began genuinely caring about each other despite manufactured conflicts, their scenarios became unpredictable. Through the training room's windows, I can see other buildings where similar sessions are taking place. The federal response to Deep Six has involved training hundreds of agents in psychological resistance techniques. But I suspect the real test will come when those agents encounter operations more sophisticated than anything we survived. The counter-program we're developing, I Continue, isn't designed to help you identify psychological manipulation. It's designed to help you maintain authentic humanity while being manipulated. Because the next generation of operations will be so sophisticated that resistance through detection will be impossible. Agent Martinez stands up from the back row. Ms. Marsh, what you're describing sounds like preparation for inevitable capture and conditioning. Are we training agents to be better victims? We're training agents to be uncontrollable subjects, I reply. There's a difference. I move to a final whiteboard displaying psychological assessment data from Deep Six survivors. The graphs show something remarkable. Subjects who'd maintained authentic emotional connections with others, even within manufactured scenarios, had demonstrated significantly higher resistance to long-term conditioning effects. The researchers' fundamental error was assuming that sophisticated manipulation could override authentic human consciousness. They could control our information, our environment, our chemical states, our sensory inputs, but they couldn't control our capacity for genuine care, real sacrifice, and authentic moral choice. The training room falls silent as agents absorb the implications. They're beginning to understand that the next phase of psychological warfare won't involve obvious enemies or clear scenarios. It will involve questioning the authenticity of every experience, every relationship, every decision, while maintaining human values despite that uncertainty. So what's our mission? Agent Kowalski asks. To be ungovernable, I say simply, not through resistance or rebellion, but through maintaining authentic humanity in any scenario, real or manufactured. To care about others genuinely, make moral choices consistently, and preserve human dignity regardless of external circumstances. As the session concludes and agents file out to continue their training, Agent Martinez approaches with an expression I've learned to recognize over the past months. The look of someone carrying classified information that changes everything. Ms. Marsh, we've received intelligence about a new operation, significantly more sophisticated than Deep Six. Multiple agencies are requesting your consultation on counter-resistance strategies. I expected this. The psychological warfare research recovered from Deep Six was too valuable, too advanced to remain dormant. Somewhere, new facilities were being constructed, new subjects were being selected, and new methods were being developed based on lessons learned from our resistance. How long do we have? I ask. Preliminary indicators suggest operational deployment within 6 months. The technology involved appears to address every vulnerability we exploited during the Deep Six breaches. Through the training facility's windows, I can see other survivors working with their own groups of federal agents, teaching resistance techniques developed through months of authentic psychological trauma. We're creating the first generation of professionals trained to maintain human consciousness under sophisticated manipulation. Not perfect protection, but genuine preparation. Agent Martinez, I say, the next time they try to control human consciousness for strategic advantage, they'll discover something important. What's that? Authentic humanity is not a vulnerability to be exploited. It's a strength that becomes more powerful under pressure. As I pack my materials and prepare for the next phase of counter-program development, I realize that my real education in emergency communications is just beginning. Not learning to document crises, but learning to maintain authentic human response during manufactured emergencies that feel completely real. The emergency alert that started everything, unknown object impact imminent, had been designed to trigger panic and desperation. Instead, it had triggered something the researchers couldn't predict or control: genuine human resistance that grew stronger under pressure. The next time they sound their false alarms, they'll find subjects who understand that the most dangerous impact isn't from unknown objects. It's from the loss of authentic humanity. and we're prepared to ensure that impact never occurs. End of Incident Log Series. Final assessment. Human consciousness remains uncontrollable when authentically maintained. Recommended action. Continue development of resistance training programs. Personal status. Recovery complete. Mission status. Ongoing. Final note. If you're reading this and questioning whether your own experiences are authentic or manufactured, remember, your capacity for genuine care about others is real regardless of external circumstances. That's where your strength lies. That's how you remain human. End recording.